I mean, that is the level of catastrophe of what was going on inside of her. Her brain hurt. It physically hurt.
For over 3 decades, Naomi Judd was a country music icon, beloved for her voice, strength, and the bond she shared with her daughters. But behind the spotlight was a life filled with pain, secrets, and silent struggles. Now, Ashley Judd is finally breaking her silence, and what she reveals about her mother's final days and their fractured relationship is deeply unsettling. From disturbing hidden details to a shocking note left behind, the truth is darker than fans ever imagined. Join us as we uncover shocking details that will leave you speechless. Before she was Naomi Judd, she was Diana Ellen, born in 1946 from Ashland, Kentucky. Diana was raised in a modest home built on hard work and quiet dreams. Her family was not wealthy, but it was close-knit. Her parents, Pauline and Charles, did their best, but the world they were raising their children in was full of limitations. Girls were expected to grow up fast and keep their heads down. Diana, however, always had a spark in her that wouldn't dim. That spark was nearly extinguished when her younger brother, Brian, fell ill. Leukemia stole him away when he was just a boy. It was a loss that cracked the foundation of her childhood. Diana was still young herself when it happened, but the absence of her brother was something she never stopped feeling. That truth hardened her in some ways and deepened her in others. As a teenager, Diana had dreams like anyone else. She wanted to go to college, maybe study art or literature, but life had other plans. At 18, she found herself pregnant. The father, Charles Jordan, left soon after he learned the news. There would be no wedding, no shared future, no helping hand. Alone and facing a future she hadn't prepared for, Diana made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would keep the baby and raise it herself. In a rush of uncertainty, she married another man, Michael Simonella. It wasn't love, not in the storybook sense, but it was a solution, temporary and imperfect. Soon after, the young couple moved to Los Angeles in search of a fresh start. It was there that she gave birth to her second daughter, Ashley, and tried to make something resembling a life. But the marriage unraveled quickly. By the time Ashley was 4, Michael was gone. Once again, Diana was a single mother, this time with 2 daughters, no partner, and barely enough income to make rent. The years that followed were filled with sacrifice. She worked multiple jobs, receptionist, waitress, clerk, whatever would pay the bills. The money was never enough. She clipped coupons religiously, skipped meals when groceries ran low, and often went without so her daughters wouldn't have to. She didn't complain. She simply endured. Diana was never one to ask for pity. And through it all, there was music. Not the kind of music that fills stadiums or sells records. It was quiet. It lived in the corners of their cramped kitchen in Granada Hills, where she and Winona would sit for hours, harmonizing to old country and gospel records. Winona, even then, had a voice that turned heads, but it was their harmony, raw, instinctual, perfectly fused, that made people pause and listen. It was the one thing that felt effortless in a life where everything else was hard. By the late 1970s, Diana had reached a crossroads. She had spent more than a decade just trying to survive, but something inside her, maybe that spark from childhood, refused to let her stay in survival mode forever. She packed up her daughters once more and returned to Tennessee. There was no clear plan, a whisper that said, maybe, just maybe, they could build something here. Back in the South, she enrolled in nursing school. It was a practical move. Steady pay, a respectable career, a way to provide for her girls. She studied at night, worked during the day, and sang when she could. She was in her 30s, exhausted and still scraping by. But she had hope again, a kiss ember, something to work toward. Then came the moment that would change everything. While working as a nurse, Diana handed a cassette tape to a patient whose father had music industry ties. On it were recordings of her and Winona singing, just mother and daughter, one guitar, no production. It was a long shot, but within weeks, they got the call. RCA was interested. In 1983, the Judds signed their first record deal. Diana, now reinvented as Naomi, stepped into a spotlight she had only dreamed of. She was nearly 40. She had no formal training, no industry backing, and no roadmap. But she had something better, a story people believed in, and a voice that carried all the weight of it. The rise was swift. Their debut EP was a hit. Country radio fell in love with their sound, a blend of old-school roots and modern energy. They didn't just sing to their audience, they sang about heartbreak, resilience, and holding on when there's nothing else left. By the mid-1980s, the Judds had become icons. Grammys followed, CMA awards, sold-out tours, magazine covers. For Naomi, it was a dream fulfilled. But for the woman who had spent most of her life just trying to keep the lights on, fame brought its own complications. She never fully shed her past. Even at her most glamorous, Naomi carried her hardships with her. In interviews, she often returned to her early years, as if trying to remind people, and herself, that the woman on the stage was built from pain as much as talent. To her daughters, this duality was familiar. Naomi could be warm and generous, lighting up a room with stories and laughter, but she could also be demanding, unpredictable, and, at times, emotionally volatile. She had survived so much that vulnerability didn't come easily. She was fiercely protective of her daughters, but her love came with expectations. She wanted excellence. She wanted strength. Ashley, in particular, grew up in that tension. The household wasn't abusive, but it was turbulent. Naomi's moods could shift without warning. There was affection, but also control. Ashley would later describe her childhood as chaotic. This was the version of Naomi that most people never saw. To the public, she was radiant, charismatic, a force of nature. But at home, she was still Diana, still carrying the weight of a teenage pregnancy, a dead brother, a broken marriage, and a life she had fought tooth and nail to rebuild. And yet, despite everything, she never stopped trying. She kept showing up for interviews, for rehearsals, for family dinners. Her resilience was undeniable. But resilience is not the same as peace. And even as the music soared, something inside Naomi remained unsettled. For a woman who had fought her way out of obscurity, poverty, and loss, standing beneath the bright lights of country music's biggest stages felt like a kind of triumph. Naomi Judd, alongside her daughter Winona, had turned kitchen table harmonies into Grammy-winning performances. They were more than a duo. They were a movement, a symbol of female resilience. To fans, they were inseparable. Mother and daughter, standing shoulder to shoulder, singing songs about heartbreak and healing. But what the public didn't see, and what Naomi tried so hard to keep hidden, was how fragile she often felt underneath the weight of it all. The 1980s had been a whirlwind. From their first major hit in 1984, Mama He's Crazy, the Judds were on a fast-moving train. Radio loved them. They won 5 Grammys, 9 CMA awards, and sold over 20 million records in just a few years. The Judds weren't just a musical act. They were a brand, a business, and above all, a story that America wanted to believe in. Naomi worked tirelessly to protect that story. Unlike most artists of her caliber, she didn't have a sprawling team handling every detail. Naomi kept a tight grip on the business side. She read every contract. For her, this wasn't about ego. It was about safety, about ensuring the stability she had never known as a young mother. Fame, she believed, could be unpredictable, but control was power. The red hair, the tailored outfits, the warm smile that never slipped. She projected confidence because she had to. But inside, the old fears hadn't gone away. The woman who'd raised 2 daughters on tips and determination never quite felt like she belonged in the room with industry executives or TV producers. Even when she was winning, and at home, the pressure only grew. Winona was no longer a teenager singing backup. She was now a young woman with her own ideas. The relationship that had once been built on maternal care and musical collaboration had become tense. Winona wanted independence. Naomi wanted to hold the center. They argued over artistic direction. The closeness that had made their harmonies so powerful also made them volatile. There were no boundaries. Every emotion, every disagreement spilled over. It wasn't that they didn't love each other, but their roles, mother, manager, partner, performer, had become so tangled, neither one knew how to separate them. Naomi's moods could shift quickly. There were good days, filled with laughter and energy, but there were dark days too, days when silence filled the house, or when everything felt like it might unravel. Ashley would later describe their home as emotionally charged, loving but unpredictable. She admired her mother's strength, but she also carried the invisible weight of growing up in a world where everything seemed just barely held together. Back on stage, none of that showed. Naomi performed with a kind of elegance that made people believe everything was fine. She smiled wide. She spoke warmly. She seemed to embody exactly what the music promised. But what the audience didn't see was how often she collapsed into bed after a performance. She was tired. And though the applause felt good, it didn't make her feel better. Not for long. In 1990, that exhaustion took on a name. Naomi was diagnosed with hepatitis C. The diagnosis stunned her. Doctors believed she had contracted it during her days as a nurse, likely from a contaminated needle. At the time, the disease was not well understood, and treatment options were limited. She was told she had just a few years to live. The news hit like a landslide. It wasn't just her health, it was her identity. The career she had built so carefully was suddenly over. She announced her retirement from performing in 1991, just as the Judds were at their peak. Fans were heartbroken. Winona would go on as a solo artist, but Naomi's voice, the guiding spirit behind the duo, was gone. At first, the quiet felt like a blessing. After years of constant movement, Naomi finally had space to breathe. She spent more time at home. She began writing, reflecting. She tried to slow down. But silence can be dangerous too. Without the distractions of touring and performing, the demons she had kept at bay began to creep back in. Depression, which had haunted her in her youth, resurfaced. The confidence she had projected for years began to erode. Without a stage, she struggled to find purpose. For someone who had fought her entire life to be seen, being invisible again was terrifying. She didn't let the public see this version of herself. Instead, she refocused her energy. She became an advocate for hepatitis C awareness, speaking openly about her diagnosis and working with public health organizations to educate others. She made TV appearances, gave speeches, tried to channel her pain into something useful. But healing isn't a straight line. Some days she felt strong, other days she didn't get out of bed. She had defeated the odds with her illness. She went into remission and lived far longer than doctors expected. But mentally, the battle was still very much alive. Naomi's depression didn't look like sadness. It looked like self-doubt, isolation, irritability. She second-guessed everything and replayed her old failures, old wounds. She feared she had been too hard on her daughters. And through it all, she still tried to protect the image. She still showed up to interviews dressed impeccably, still posed for cameras with that familiar smile. But those closest to her knew Naomi was tired. The kind of fatigue that builds over a lifetime of carrying more than one person should ever have to carry. As Ashley and Winona moved forward in their own careers, acting, music, advocacy, Naomi often watched from the sidelines with a mix of pride and distance. She loved her daughters deeply, but she also felt sometimes like she didn't quite know where she fit in anymore. They had grown into women with their own voices, and Naomi, for all her strength, wasn't always sure if she still had one. Fame had given her a platform, a voice, a chance to be heard. But when the spotlight dimmed, Naomi was left to face what had always lived in the quiet, the unhealed parts, the unspoken fears, the grief that no award could ever undo. And in that stillness, she began to feel the full weight of a life lived on high alert. Every family has secrets. Most stay tucked away in quiet corners, never spoken. But in the Judd family, the silence wasn't just quiet. For years, Naomi Judd had worked to preserve a certain image of her family. But behind that image was a history that didn't always fit into neat and polished interviews. One of the most painful truths surfaced in fragments, and it would take decades before the full weight of it settled in. Winona Judd, Naomi's eldest daughter and musical partner, grew up believing that her father was Michael Simonella, the man Naomi had married shortly after becoming pregnant. He was the man on her birth certificate, the man who helped raise her, even after the marriage ended. But he wasn't her biological father. Winona wouldn't find this out until she was in her 30s, during an emotionally vulnerable time when she was already trying to untangle her own identity apart from the Judds. The truth was, something Naomi had kept to herself for years. Winana's real father was Charles Jordan, a man Naomi had dated in high school. He had walked away when Naomi became pregnant. Michael Simonella had stepped in to fill the space, giving the appearance of stability even if it never quite held. The revelation wasn't just a personal betrayal. It cracked the foundation of Winana's entire sense of self. Naomi, when confronted, said she had been trying to protect her daughter, that she had done what she thought was best. But for Winana, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like deception. And it made her question what else had been buried under the weight of their public life. Trust, already fragile in a mother-daughter relationship stretched by fame, fractured even further. Their relationship, long known to be complex, became harder to navigate. Naomi was deeply hurt by Winana's reaction. She saw it not as betrayal, but as sacrifice. In her mind, she had given everything to keep their lives afloat. She had chosen silence because the truth, at the time, felt too dangerous, too destabilizing. She had made a decision in her 20s to survive, not realizing that the consequences would ripple through decades. Winana, for her part, tried to understand, but understanding doesn't always erase pain. In interviews, she spoke about her struggles with forgiveness, her effort to rebuild trust. She said she loved her mother deeply, but love, she admitted, was complicated. And Ashley, who had grown up watching the dynamic between her mother and sister like a tide rising and falling, was caught in the middle. She wasn't part of the musical act, but she was part of the emotional landscape. She saw how hard Naomi tried to keep the family together. She also saw how often that effort came at the cost of truth. Years later, Ashley would say that her family was loving, but emotionally unwell. That powerful statement spoke to the undercurrent that had shaped all three of their lives. The Judds were not broken, but they were wounded, and those wounds, hidden behind chart-topping albums and televised smiles, had never been allowed to fully heal. There were other fractures too, moments less public, but no less painful. Ashley had her own journey through trauma. She later revealed that she had been abused as a child, not by anyone in the family, but in environments where she felt unprotected. It left her with deep emotional scars and a lifelong struggle to feel safe, seen, and whole. She never blamed her mother outright, but she acknowledged the emotional instability of her upbringing, the chaos, the lack of safety, the sense that things could collapse at any moment. For Naomi, hearing these things from her daughters was hard. She had spent so much of her life trying to be the opposite of what she'd grown up with, trying to give her children the very things she'd been denied. And yet, despite all that effort, she still couldn't shield them from pain. That knowledge haunted her. In one of her final interviews, she admitted, "I was always afraid of losing everything. I never thought we were safe." That fear had driven her, but it had also isolated her. It kept her from saying what needed to be said. It kept her from being the soft place her daughters sometimes needed. And yet, the love never disappeared. Even through the silence, the tension, and the pain, Naomi loved her daughters with a fierceness that could be overwhelming. She wanted them to have what she never did. But sometimes, in her quest to give them everything, she forgot that what they needed most was simply her, as she was. Not as Naomi Judd the icon, but as Diana Judd, their mother. The secrets in the Judd family didn't destroy them, but they did change them. They changed the way Winana saw herself. They deepened Ashley's understanding of legacy and loss, and they forced Naomi, in her later years, to confront not just what she had built, but what it had cost. And when the final chapter of Naomi Judd's life was written, not by her hand, but by her illness, it was these truths that got even more complicated, because behind every public figure is a private life, and behind every mother is a woman who once was a daughter too, and sometimes carrying more pain than she knows how to speak aloud. Naomi Judd didn't plan a farewell. She didn't stage a final moment of peace. Her passing wasn't preceded by a long goodbye or softened by sentimental closure. It came with a note, short, jagged, unfinished, the kind of message that feels less like a goodbye and more like a final cry from someone who was already far away. In her own handwriting, Naomi left behind just a few words. "Do not let Winana attend my funeral." The sentence was brief, but in its brevity, to many the note seemed cruel. But grief doesn't operate in logic, and neither does mental illness. Those who suffer from it often struggle to translate their pain, to name it, to soften it for others. In the end, Naomi's note wasn't so much a statement of rejection as it was a reflection of her internal disorientation, a woman unsure of her place in the hearts of those who loved her most. For Winona, those words landed like a second death. It wasn't just the loss of her mother, it was the message that still felt deliberate. And yet, she understood. She had seen the shame Naomi felt when the outside world misunderstood her illness, and she had felt the helplessness of being close to someone you cannot save from themselves. So Winona didn't retaliate. She didn't fight the words in court. She didn't release statements to dispute her mother's intent. She did something much harder. She showed up. She walked into the funeral service with grace, with quiet dignity, not because her mother had asked her to, but because she knew what her mother would have wanted if her illness hadn't been speaking for her, and because love, especially the hard kind, doesn't follow instructions. Grief is rarely clean. It doesn't come in packages of resolution and peace. It comes layered with questions, regrets, and what-ifs. And for Winona, that note became both a wound and a symbol, a final mirror reflecting everything that had gone unsaid between them. Ashley, who had been the one to discover Naomi's body, carried her own version of that mirror. She had held her mother in death. She had witnessed the last physical chapter of Naomi's life. And now, with this note, she was left to hold the emotion inside. There were no public fights between the sisters, no televised tears of confrontation, only the unspoken understanding that Naomi had left them with a grief no funeral could resolve. Adding to the heartbreak was the realization that Naomi had left Winona out of her will. The document, written several years before her death, granted her entire estate to her husband, Larry Strickland. No mention of Winona, no allocation of personal items, and no recognition of the daughter with whom she had shared the world's stage. Winona didn't contest it. She told reporters simply, "My mother was entitled to her privacy." But privately, the sting remained. This wasn't about money. It was about feeling chosen, to be excluded, both in life's final letter and in death's legal documentation, hurt in ways that can't be measured in assets. It hurt because it made concrete something she had always feared but never confirmed, that even after all the songs, all the years, all the tears and triumphs, something had remained unresolved. Still, she chose love. In the months following Naomi's death, Winona continued to speak to her mother, not through interviews but in quieter ways. She looked for signs. She talked to her during car rides. She visited the places they had once shared. She even said she sometimes felt her mother's presence in small, unexpected moments. A breeze, a scent, a line from a song playing in a store. In these fragments, she found comfort, not healing, not yet, but something close. For Ashley, the grief took a different shape. Having been there in Naomi's final moments, she had seen a kind of rawness that most people never witness. It changed her. She began to speak more openly about mental illness and the importance of shifting language. In interviews, Ashley spoke not just as a daughter, but as an advocate. She wanted to change the way we talk about pain. She wanted people to understand that her mother didn't choose death out of selfishness, but out of desperation, that her brain, at the end, had stopped telling the truth. And as she said those words, she wasn't just telling Naomi's story, she was helping others rewrite their own. Because Naomi's final note wasn't just an expression of anguish, it was a window, a chance for those left behind to do something her illness wouldn't let her do. They let Naomi be a full person, not just a performer, not just a mother, but a woman, complex, brilliant, wounded, brave, and in doing so, they allowed everyone watching to see something deeper, that behind every public life is a private struggle, that sometimes the people who give us the most hope are the ones who carry the deepest pain. Naomi Judd's final message was not her last word. The true final chapter is still being written, by her daughters, by her fans, and by anyone who has ever loved someone they couldn't save. For the Judd family, that legacy was once defined by harmony, quite literally, two voices, mother and daughter, blending into something that felt timeless. But now, in the years following Naomi Judd's passing, that legacy is being reshaped. Winona returned to the road quickly. It surprised some. Her mother had only passed under deeply personal circumstances, and now she was on stage again, singing the very songs they had once performed side by side. But for Winona, the answer was simple. The stage was where she had always found her mother. Winona didn't pretend everything was okay. She talked to the audience. She told them about the grief, the heartbreak, the unresolved tensions. She spoke about the beauty and difficulty of their bond, and in doing so, she created space for laughter, for tears, for 1,000 fans to hold their own memories alongside hers. "I sing because it's what I know," she said in one show, "but I hurt too, and I bring that with me." She brought it to every venue, every city, and in return, the audiences gave her back something rare: understanding, forgiveness, a quiet kind. She brought it to every venue, every city, and in return, the audiences gave her back something rare: understanding, forgiveness, a quiet kind of solidarity that you don't find in chart rankings or critical reviews. Her grief wasn't meant for the spotlight. It moved inwards, into rooms without applause, into interviews not about entertainment, but healing, into intimate conversations where vulnerability wasn't a performance, but a necessity. She sat with therapists. She showed up at mental health forums. She gave her time and voice to organizations focused on emotional well-being and trauma recovery. She didn't speak as a star. She spoke as someone who had been there, who had seen firsthand what mental illness can do, who had learned painfully that love doesn't always save someone, but it still matters. Ashley talked about her mother with softness, with complexity. She didn't turn Naomi into a symbol or a cautionary tale. She held space for every part of her, joyful, erratic, brilliant, and struggling. And in that space, she made it okay for others to be honest about the contradictions in their own families. She said often that her mother tried, that she fought hard. Instead, she shifted the spotlight onto what Naomi had lived for: her daughters, her music, and her fans. That, Ashley believed, was worth remembering more than anything else. Together, Ashley and Winona have created something rare: a public grief that doesn't ask for pity, only understanding. A story that doesn't erase the hard parts, but holds them with care. They could have chosen to protect the family name, to silence the uncomfortable truths, but instead, they leaned in. They told the world, "This is who our mother was, and this is who we are, still becoming." In doing so, they expanded the definition of legacy. Naomi Judd will always be remembered for her voice, her music, her rise from working-class roots to stardom. But now she's also remembered as someone who made mistakes, who struggled, who carried pain, and who raised 2 daughters strong enough to carry the truth. The Judds' image once leaned toward perfection: big hair, matching dresses, flawless harmonies. But today, their story is about something even more powerful: transparency, not to make headlines, but to make room for themselves and for everyone who sees their own family in the cracks between verses. Winona continues to tour. She continues to sing. She sometimes talks to Naomi in the quiet backstage moments. Other times, she speaks through the songs. Her voice, still as rich as ever, carries the ache of what's been lost and the love that hasn't gone anywhere. Ashley continues her advocacy. She writes. She speaks. She sits with people in pain. She reminds them that being present is sometimes more important than being perfect, that showing up, even when you don't have the answers, is an act of love. And in the music, the Judds' music, Naomi still lives. Songs like "Mama, He's Crazy," "Love Can Build a Bridge," and "Grandpa, Tell Me About the Good Old Days" play on, not just as hits, but as hymns, for healing, for remembering. Each time a record spins or a chorus plays on the radio, it brings her back, not as a figure frozen in tragedy, but as a woman who tried, who loved deeply, who gave her daughters more than fame. She gave them roots. That's what legacy really is. It's what's left when the lights go down. It's the way someone's story continues through the people who choose to tell it with truth and tenderness. And for Naomi Judd, that story is still being told by 2 daughters, one on stage, one off, both still singing. In the final days of April 2022, country music stood still. Naomi Judd, one half of the legendary duo The Judds, was gone. Her death came just 24 hours before she was set to be honored by the Country Music Hall of Fame. A moment that was supposed to celebrate a lifetime of music and perseverance had turned, without warning, into mourning. Most people found out through headlines. Others saw it on television or heard it on the radio. But one person lived it firsthand, her daughter, Naomi Judd. Ashley didn't release a statement right away. She didn't sit for interviews or post tributes. Instead, she disappeared from public view. In the noise of the news cycle, her silence stood out. Because behind that silence, something unspoken waited. Not just grief, but a story. One that was painful, human, and far more complicated than most people knew. That morning, Ashley had gone to her mother's home, not far from her own in the Tennessee countryside. The two lived close, only a short drive apart. Naomi had been preparing for the Hall of Fame induction. There had been talk of outfits, travel, what she might say on stage. But when Ashley opened the door, all of that fell away. Naomi had died. Ashley found her mother's body. She stayed with her until help arrived. She sat in that room with everything that came with it: shock, disbelief, blood, and silence. It was not a moment made for cameras or headlines. It was a private, irreversible loss, one that would change everything. For days, Ashley said nothing. The family asked for privacy. The public respected it for a while, but speculation grows in silence. And before long, the gaps in the story were being filled with rumor. Ashley didn't want her mother's death to become a story people consumed like entertainment, but she also understood something else. Without the truth, misunderstanding would take its place, and so, slowly, carefully, she began to speak. Naomi had lived with mental illness for many years. She spoke about it publicly, sometimes in interviews, sometimes in writing. She called it a disease of the mind, something that had stolen her ability to see herself clearly. To the world, Naomi was vibrant, successful, adored. But in her mind, those things felt distant and unreal. Mental illness is often invisible until it becomes unbearable, and in Naomi's case, it had been building quietly. Even her daughters, who loved her, lived close by and supported her, didn't always know how bad it had gotten. That's the nature of the illness. It lies. It isolates. It convinces the person suffering that they're alone, even when they're surrounded by love. Ashley spoke about this too. She said her mother's brain had become so sick that it hurt, physically, not metaphorically. Naomi, she explained, wasn't just sad. She was in pain, deep, relentless pain that couldn't be seen from the outside. Pain that no achievement, no award, no applause could quiet. That's part of why Naomi's death hurt so many people. She was a public figure, yes, but she was also someone who had seemed to overcome the impossible. Poverty, teen pregnancy, single motherhood, career failure, hepatitis C. She had climbed out of every hole. She had survived everything. And yet, in the end, survival wasn't enough. Ashley didn't tell her mother's story to protect a legacy. She told it to reveal it fully. She wanted people to understand that Naomi wasn't weak. She wasn't selfish. She was tired, and the disease she lived with had finally become stronger than her ability to keep fighting, a life that included kindness, even in her darkest hours. Ashley shared how, just days before her death, Naomi had given up her first-class plane seat to a Make-A-Wish child. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't make a show of it. She simply saw a child in need and gave what she could. That moment, quiet and compassionate, reflected the heart that so many people never truly saw. But not all of what Naomi left behind was gentle. Among her final words was a handwritten note. In it, she wrote a sentence that would haunt her daughters. "Do not let Wainana attend my funeral." The word "not" was crossed out, but the damage was done. Naomi had, in her final moments, written that her daughter suffered from a mental illness. Whether it was confusion, anger, or anguish, it was clear that Naomi had left behind more than sorrow. She had left behind unresolved pain. Even so, Wainana came. She stood beside her family, beside Ashley, and mourned her mother. There was no feud, no legal battle, no public breakdown, just grief, heavy, complicated, and private. Ashley later said something that stayed with many people. "I didn't cause it, I couldn't control it, and I couldn't cure it." For anyone who's lost someone to suicide, Those words ring painfully true. They don't offer comfort, but they offer freedom from the guilt that so often follows loss. Naomi Judd's story is not clean or easy. It is the story of a woman who gave everything she had to the world, her voice, her strength, her story. But in the end, she had nothing left to give herself. Ashley Judd didn't speak to tidy up that story. She spoke to let it breathe, to honor not just the woman her mother was, but the woman she couldn't always be. How did Naomi Judd's story impact you? Have you or someone you love faced similar silent struggles? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for further updates.